Thank you, Subbu, for the introduction. So let's talk about how Synergy builds products and product features that are so delightful that they captivate the end users. So let's step back and see where we are today. This 2019 and 2 decades into the millennium. We are pretty good at building software that works. We know our agile, we know our lean, we do Scrum, we do sprints, TDD, BDD, continuous integration and continuous delivery, DevSecOps, Kanban, and what have you. So all these processes and tools have enabled us to be able to build software to any requirement that is stated. So if someone tells me or us what he or she wants, we can build that software. But that is just half the solution to the problem, because we don't really know what the end user wants, and usually what he says is not what he wants, and what he wants is not what he needs. So being able to deliver something after we know what is required is important, but it is not completely fulfilling the business objective of giving the user what he really wants and needs. So let's see why this. So let's delve a little bit why the end user is not getting what he wants and why. And the symptom of it is that most software is not used. Is it because it's not relevant, or is it because it's not simple enough, or is it not friendly or usable or needed? Is it not cheap enough or quick enough or safe enough? Maybe all of these. So we need to think hard as to why most software is not used. And let's take a look at some of the numbers that are published. So we did a little bit of research to find out that typically this is a dated research, 2016 research, but things haven't changed much. They might have become worse. So this is about apps. So when a user downloads mobile apps, within the first month, 64% of them abandon it, and by the third month it's 80%. So, and I can imagine, because I have so many apps which I have downloaded which I have never used. So I can imagine how the magnitude of the problem of abandonment of apps. Similar survey done even before, it's even dated way before, but still things might not have been any different. I could not find something which is more recent. About this is about use of features. So what this survey says that 45% of features are never used and 19% of them are rarely used. And I can believe it. So, it's not a small problem you're talking about. If you see the dollar numbers, it's a lot of money that is being wasted here. It's like bridges, or a bridge that is never used, or a car that is never driven, or a device that is hardly used. So how do we get users to use what we are building? So game designers and people who build software that is getting people hooked to the games, is they have done a lot of this thinking. And let's take a look at how they do it. So the basic idea here, and these are two pictures that you see in front of you. The one on the left is by Neil in his famous book called The Hook. So in this, a user gets involved, or he starts using your application with a trigger, which could be an external or internal trigger, depending on. An external trigger could be an email, and an internal trigger could be, you're hungry. So you start using the app, and then you take some action, and this action is so easy, so smooth, and so intuitive that you are able to take that without much effort. So once you take that action, you get a variable reward, and the reward is variable, and that is important, because if you get the same reward for same action, often you'll find that users get bored. So if you have variable reward, that keeps the user engaged and interested is what. So there was an experiment called the Skinner box experiment, which was conducted, and based on the results of that experiment, it's the dopamine hit that you get in anticipation of the reward and not after you get the reward. So sure of getting a reward no matter what, you will not have that anticipation. So the anticipation is when you're not sure, and then that's when this increase in adrenaline level comes. So that is what gets people hooked. And finally, when they go through these type of action reward kind of cycles very often, they end up investing a lot of their learning or a lot of their data or a lot of their connections, such as friends connections, and they build some level of trust in the application, and all that can be called as investment, which prevents a user from moving away from the application. Even if he were to or she were to see a better app there in the market, he would not move away, because he or she would have all the friends and connections and photos and the learning that one has in that invested. So that's the hook model. On the right hand side is another model by the game thinking expert Amy Jo Kim, which is similar. So you start with triggers. It could be again situational, external, or internal, which I have described earlier. Then it gets you involved in an engaging activity. So this is an action which is very engaging, which kind of gets the user to fully focus his or her attention, and then you get a feedback. So the reward here is the feedback and progress that you see that you're making. So the progress part is very important, because the thinking that Amy has is about, what gets the user really engaged is pleasure, or that he or she derives out of learning. And there are other thinkers here, including someone who's written a book called The Theory of Fun. So in this book also, they have discovered that the fun comes out of learning, and that's what keeps the user engaged. So when you have a more complex game that is being mastered by a user, that gives him some level of kick of having cracked a higher level or a more more difficult situation. So the same thing happens even in, you can build that into your application, where you give the benefit to the user of, or you give the ability to the user to discover new and more complex features, and in the process the user learns and becomes a master user of the application. And once that happens, that is the investment. So the loop completes when the user actually goes to the next level, where he makes not only himself smarter, but also the application becomes smarter, because now application knows the user better, and he is able to configure the application or add some data to the application or value to the application, which is the investment that makes the application and the user smarter to give bigger value and higher value outcomes. So these are the two models, and then we at Synergip had further evolved thinking as to how we will utilize these models to build engaging software. So we have a similar loop here. The first loop in our thinking is effort. So you have some effort that you have to take to use the product, and it should be so minimal, it should be so smooth and easy and intuitive that every visitor would want to become a user, and then he or she receives such a valuable variable reward. Again, I don't need to talk about why it is variable. It will make the user return for more, and when that becomes a habit, repeated user use will form a habit, and it would end up having the user store a lot of data, photos, comments, reviews, ratings, and connections, etc. in your application, which in turn results in commitment. So it's the learning to use the application. It is also the application becoming smarter because of the data that has been shared with the application, and the application uses artificial intelligence and machine learning to learn from that data to become to provide or to predict what the user wants, even before the user says it, or the user tells, or user acts in a certain way. It is predicting ahead of time, because you already have a pattern built into the data that has got accumulated over a period or compiled over a period of time. So this is the virtuous circle that we are trying to build, so that every visitor becomes a user, every user becomes a repeat user, and no one ever unsubscribes. So that's the vision with which we are trying to build applications. So much for how to build applications, but there are a lot of these assumptions that are underlying this, and we need to have these assumptions or these hypotheses validated. So we have to follow hypothesis driven development. So it's nothing but the lean learn, build and measure cycle, where you start with an experiment. First you document the assumptions that hypothesis you have, so we'll see some practical example there. Then you formulate hypothesis, you design the experiment, you develop the experiment, then you run the experiment, and then you synthesize and analyze and learn from it, and then move to the next set of assumptions. So that's the hypothesis driven development cycle. So there are hypotheses that need to be validated by iteratively building and field testing features and functionality to get the desired response or behavior from the end user. So this is the cycle that we talked about. So let's see in our way of, so we talked about effort, reward, habit and commitment in the previous slide. So what are the hypotheses we are talking about? So any hypothesis can be put on a card, the green colored card that you see. This is Courtesy ThoughtWorks, which says the capability, that what is the capability that you're trying to build and what will be the outcome if you build that capability, and when will you know, and how will you know that you have really got the desired outcome? What's the measure of success? So what is the measurable signal that you see outward to know that you have really succeeded? So there are a number of these hypotheses. That the first hypothesis is that the user interface will be relevant and quick and intuitive enough for the visitor to become a user, right? So that's the capability is quick and intuitive UI, the outcome is minimum effort, and the measurable signal is a visitor becoming a user. Similarly, there is a hypothesis that the value delivered is highly rewarding and promises to be even more so for a user to return and try again. So how will you measure that? By seeing that the user becomes a repeat user. So the capability of increasing value per visit with every visit is realized by the user. The outcome is he gets a very highly rewarding experience, but the measurable signal is the user becoming a repeat user. And then there are these complex features that you have built into the product so that the user will be able to get empowered by learning these features. And the outcome is that he will be empowered, and the measurable signal here is that he becomes a habitual user because he has now mastered these complex features, and that really makes him a power user. Lastly, the capability of artificial intelligence and machine learning makes the app smarter by the data that is being shared by the user over these multiple cycles of use, and thus the user ends up becoming a permanent user, and such a user will never unsubscribe. So these are various hypotheses that we talked about that need to be validated using hypothesis driven development. The hypothesis that the user will remain committed, the hypothesis that AI and algorithms will deliver the increasing value that we are talking about. So to get these hypotheses validated, you need to use certain tools and techniques, and the remaining part of the presentation we are going to talk about what are those techniques that we need to use for doing hypothesis driven development, which also itself is a technique.